Hey guys, welcome back to my channel and welcome to an unsolved case. So today we are focusing on the case of Mr. Cruel, which is an Australian case. So we're going to be taking this case all the way back to 1987. It was a Saturday, August 27, in the Melbourne suburb of Lower Plenty. This is a suburb on the outskirts of Melbourne. A mystery man removed a pane of glass from a lounge room window at about 4 AM and broke into a family home. He was armed with a knife and a gun and was wearing a black balaclava. And this balaclava was quite identifiable as it was black but had white stitching around the eyes and the mouth. So it was like a contrasting black and white, so it's quite easy to remember. So the house consisted of a mother, a father, their 6-year-old son and their 11-year-old daughter. The intruder crept into the parents' bedroom, woke them up and threatened them with his knife and gun and told them to lie on their stomachs. He then proceeded to tie their hands and ankles together before locking both parents in their own wardrobe. He also blindfolded and gagged them. Their 6-year-old son was also tied to his own bed, blindfolded and gagged. The perpetrator also used a knot, which was quite commonly used amongst people with nautical experience or sailors. So that was something that was taken note of. The perpetrator then crept into the 11-year-old girl's bedroom and raped her. And this 11-year-old girl has not been identified to the media. He attacked the young girl for over 2 hours and even took breaks in between to walk through the family home and even had time to stop and make himself a meal. According to the 11-year-old victim, her attacker even stopped to make a phone call on the family's home phone. She said the phone call sounded like a threatening one, demanding people on the other end move their children or they would be next. And he called the people he had phoned up bozo. However, when police investigated the family phone records, no such call had taken place. And this would become a bit of a trademark of this perpetrator by planting a red herring or a distraction for the investigators to throw them off course in what they were looking into. So just doing something out of the blue, which you will see as we go on in this video. He also cut the phone lines to the house before he left, and very randomly he stole a box of classic records and a blue jacket from the home. So now we're moving forward to the following year, 1988. We're looking at just after Christmas on December the 27th in a suburb in Melbourne called Ringwood. This suspect broke into the back door of the home at 5:30 in the morning and he had again a knife and a handgun with him. But this time he had a blue balaclava on and blue overalls. The house consisted of a mum and dad and their 4 daughters. John Wills, the father of the household, was awoken by a sensation touching his temple and the words, "Don't be a hero," before seeing a gun was being pointed to his head. The perpetrator had a knife in his other hand. Similar to his first crime, he ordered the parents to lie on their stomachs while he tied their hands and feet together, while he blindfolded them and gagged them, and he assured the parents that he was only there to take their money. He took $35 from the parents' bedside table before cutting all the house phone lines. He then proceeded to the bedroom that the Wills' 4 daughters shared, and when he entered, he called out one of the girls' names, 10-year-old Sharon Wills. And we'll get into it later as to how the perpetrator may have possibly known Sharon's name. He grabbed Sharon, put tape over her eyes and a ball gag in her mouth, and unlike with his first crime, he actually abducted Sharon from her house. 18 hours later, Sharon was released on the grounds of Bayswater High School and she was relatively unharmed considering what she had gone through. She was wearing a green plastic bag as clothing when a woman saw a young girl standing on a street. It was just after midnight, and the woman that found her said she appeared to be calm and in good spirits. Sharon could not give a physical description of her attacker due to being blindfolded, but she described him as being softly spoken but rather blunt. One of the words Sharon used to describe her attacker was gentle, something that really shocked investigators. One vital piece of information that Sharon did give investigators was that she could hear low-flying aircrafts overhead, possibly indicating the perpetrator may live near the airport or under a flight path, and this piece of information becomes very important later in the investigation. The perpetrator had also fed Sharon, giving her a Vegemite sandwich, some milk and some lemonade. Before releasing Sharon, her attacker gave her a thorough clean, most likely to get rid of any DNA evidence. However, he went quite above and beyond. He brushed and flossed her teeth, he clipped her fingernails, her toenails, and more. Unfortunately, Sharon's attacker had virtually left no evidence or DNA anywhere, basically leading the case to a dead end. They did, however, quickly connect it to the 11-year-old girl's case the previous year. Then, a year and a half later, the same man struck again. On July the 3rd, 1990, in the Melbourne suburb of Canterbury, I believe it's pronounced, which is a very expensive and elusive suburb, might I add, being home to politicians, businessmen, and even Kylie Minogue's family at one point. He broke into the family home at 11:30 at night, containing two girls that were sisters, Nicola and Fiona Linus. Nicola was 13 years old and Fiona was 15. The girls' parents were out that night, only for a few hours, as they were attending a farewell party being thrown for them, as the family was actually planning to move back to England where they had originally come from. The girls were awoken to a masked intruder holding a gun and a knife, yelling at them. He told Nicola to go get her school uniform while he tied Fiona to her bed. Nicola was bound, gagged, and had tape over her eyes, similar to the previous attacks. The intruder informed 15-year-old Fiona that her father would have to pay 25 grand for her sister's safe return, which was an indicator that potentially the perpetrator knew the family was well off or knew them in person through business, and this is something that investigators did look into. He disabled the home phones and looked around for money before abducting Nicola and taking her back to his house. Her parents, Brian and Rosemary, returned 25 minutes later to the horrible scene and their 15-year-old daughter tied up to her own bed. This time, the perpetrator had upped the ante again, and at the 36-hour mark, Nicola's father held a press conference stating he would pay any ransom just to let him know how to pay it to him. And once again, this intruder had left no evidence behind at the scene, making it almost impossible to track him. Nicola's abductor molested her for 50 hours before releasing her at a power substation in the suburb of Kew. It was also Nicola's 14th birthday. Nicola was found dressed and wrapped in a blanket. Her attacker told her to stay there with her blindfold on until he had driven away, at which point she could remove her blindfold and go find help. When Nicola believed it was safe to do so, she removed her blindfold and made her way to the nearest house to phone her parents. It was almost 2 in the morning and her father had been up worrying and praying for her safe return when he received Nicola's call. Nicola was actually able to reveal a few details about the perpetrator, such as an average of what his height may be and his hair colour. Nicola was also able to give pretty good details about the perpetrator's home. So Nicola, when she had the chance, actually removed her blindfold momentarily so she could look around. She got details of the interior of his home and the interior of his car. Like Sharon Wills, Nicola had been bathed and washed upon her return. And also like Nicola, they were both attached to the perpetrator's bed with a neck brace. Nicola had even heard her attacker talking to someone, but she never heard anyone actually reply to him. And police believe this was once again some sort of red herring or something to throw them off their investigation, possibly to make it look like two people were involved in the crime. And like Sharon, Nicola heard low-flying aircrafts in the area. Investigators were completely baffled by these 3 attacks on these young girls. The perpetrator was clearly a smart man that left behind no evidence whatsoever, leading to dead ends in every single investigation. And then a 4th attack happened, and this attack was a little bit different. It was Saturday, April 13th, 1991 in Templestowe, Melbourne. John and Phyllis Chan were the proud parents of 3 young girls, Carly, Karen and Karmein. And coincidentally, Karmein actually went to school with the 3rd victim, Nicola. Karmein, who was 13 years old, was babysitting her younger sisters, who were 9 and 7, while her parents worked at their Chinese restaurant, which was only 10 minutes from the family home. This was a very common occurrence, as John and Phyllis, who were actually immigrants to Australia, worked really hard in their business ventures to build a great life for their 3 daughters. So all 3 sisters were sitting in their parents' bedroom watching a Marilyn Monroe film when the 2 oldest daughters decided to head to the kitchen to get something to eat. However, in the hallway, the 2 girls have found a man in a balaclava and grey tracksuit standing with a knife. He had broken in through a cut screen window. He told the girls, "I only want your money," as he did with every attack, before locking the 2 youngest girls in their own wardrobe and barricading them in with their bed. He told them, "I won't hurt you," before abducting Karmein. When Carly and Karen finally pushed their way out of the wardrobe, they could see no sign of Karmein whatsoever, and they immediately called their parents at the restaurant. Before leaving, the perpetrator actually sprayed their vehicle with spray paint with the words, "Asian drug deal, payback and more to come." However, once again, investigators believed that these spray painted words were a red herring, a distraction to take them away from the real reason for the abduction. However, they still did have to look through the Chan's family history and business dealings to establish whether they did have any enemies. 72 hours after Karmein's abduction, she still had not been returned. So her mother made a very emotional plea on television, begging for her daughter's safe return and even offering ransom money to see her daughter safe again. Investigators believed that Karmein would be released like the previous abductions. However, Karmein, unlike the previous 3 attacks, was not released. There were actually a few doubts as to whether this 4th attack was related to the first 3, as it was slightly different, but it is widely thought that this is the same attacker, and this was also thought to be this perpetrator's last known attack, although he's actually a potential suspect for many other assaults on children in the mid-1980s. So on May the 6th, 1991, 23 days after Karmein's abduction, the investigators formed a task force called the Spectrum Task Force to investigate Karmein's abduction, as well as investigate the 3 previous abductions. It was Victoria's largest ever police investigation at the time, and they actually offered a $100,000 reward for any information leading to solving Karmein's disappearance. Unfortunately, on April the 9th, 1992, almost 1 year to the date after Karmein's abduction, her remains were discovered. A man walking his dog spotted what he thought to be a human skull in some landfill not far from the Chan's home. The skull, as well as portions of the jaw and neck, were found in the landfill area of Edgar's Creek in Melbourne, and they were confirmed to be those of Karmein Chan. The skull had 3 bullet holes in the back of the head, and it was shot execution style. It was thought the body had been there for about 12 months. It was thought perhaps Karmein had recognised her abductor, or even attempted to pull off his balaclava and she identified him, and this basically forced him to kill Karmein, unlike his other abductions. Karmein's own mother described Karmein as a stubborn girl that would have fought against being victimized. However, as his crimes did escalate each time, it is possible that killing his victim was just the next stepping stone in his plan. And unfortunately, in 1994, the Spectrum Task Force disbanded with no perpetrator brought to justice. So a newspaper covering the investigation labelled the anonymous serial rapist and now killer Mr. Cruel, and this name was adopted by the media. So investigators, including Spectrum Task Force, developed somewhat of a profile of what Mr. Cruel may have been like, starting with some of the following information on him. So it is believed that Mr. Cruel took photos or videos of his attacks, as one of the girls did spot a video camera on a tripod at the end of Mr. Cruel's bed, and investigators believe that Mr. Cruel would have held on to these videos or photos over the years as memories or keepsakes of his attacks. They believe he would, if he is still alive, be swapping child pornography or looking at it. According to his victims, he used the phrases bozo, worrywart and missy quite often, and had a very non-specific Australian accent. He was thought to be between the ages of 30 and 50 years old, and somewhere between 173 and 180 centimetres tall. He also had fair to sandy coloured hair and eyebrows, and sometimes sported a ginger beard. He was of a medium build and had a little bit of a pot belly. It was also speculated that perhaps Mr. Cruel worked in the education system, as all of his attacks happened to fall during school holidays. Mr. Cruel was also, and strangely enough given his nickname, described by his victims as being very soft-spoken, easygoing, and relaxed when committing his crimes. Mr. Cruel also bathed his victims very carefully, one victim even describing it as like a mother bathing their baby. Investigators were slightly concerned that the label Mr. Cruel may throw people off that knew the perpetrator in real life. Steve Fontana, a former Spectrum Task Force member, stated, "He's very intelligent and probably comes across as being a reasonable sort of person. He is very talented and will be very meticulous in the way he goes about things." Investigators think that Mr. Cruel would actually be anything but cruel in his everyday life, potentially being involved in community projects and being considered a good neighbour. He would also come across as very interested in or very dedicated to children. And if you saw my last video on the Claremont serial killer, this will ring a bell to you, these characteristics where he was considered a really great guy, very kind, a great neighbour, a community player involved in his community, and he was a serial killer on the side. So I thought that was an interesting point. They also believed that he was probably a obsessive compulsive character, washing his hands quite often, for example. As stated, Mr. Cruel was intelligent and meticulous, considering he never left any trace of evidence or DNA behind at the crime scenes. At least none that forensic technology could identify at the time. As I said, he always thoroughly bathed his victims, always had his balaclava on, and always wore gloves, and made sure that his victims were blindfolded. It was also clear to investigators that Mr. Cruel had to have staked out his victims weeks or even months in advance, because he seemed to know their habits and lifestyle, and when parents would be out and kids would be home alone. So back to the clue about the low flying aircrafts over Mr. Cruel's house that two of the girls heard. Investigators actually went and investigated so many houses near the airport and that are directly under the flight paths, but they had no success. Sketches of Mr. Cruel's home interior and car interior were also released, thanks to Nicola Linus being able to see some of her surroundings when she briefly removed her blindfold. Police searched 30,000 homes, interviewed 27,000 suspects, and had 10,000 tips come in on the Mr. Cruel case, costing upwards of $4 million. Police even wrote to the state's 10,000 doctors, pleading with them to break the doctor-patient confidentiality agreement because they believed that Mr. Cruel may have sought help after Karmein's attack. There was now a $300,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of Mr. Cruel. And in 2016, on the 25th anniversary of Karmein's disappearance, the reward money was raised to $1 million. So in 2010, a new task force was actually established following substantial new intelligence, and they named it Task Force Apollo. It was revealed that some new leads had come in the Mr. Cruel investigation over the last year or so. The Apollo Task Force also reviewed the Spectrum Task Force investigation, which I had mentioned disbanded in '94. Police have admitted, however, that crucial evidence from the Mr. Cruel crime scenes have gone missing over the years. One important piece of evidence being a piece of tape Mr. Cruel used to tie one of his victims' hands. New DNA technology may have been able to be used on the tape to identify the perpetrator. However, we are never going to know due to the fact it is missing, which is pretty sloppy work on behalf of, I guess, the department that looks after evidence in cases. This could have solved the Mr. Cruel case, but now we're never going to know if it would have or not. Also in April of 2016, as well as raising the reward money to $1 million, police released a 1994 dossier, which is like a file or report on the crimes, which was nicknamed the Sierra Files. It was released to the Herald Sun newspaper here in Australia, and it contained vital pieces of information that had never been released to the public before in this dossier. And this also included 7 possible suspects in the Mr. Cruel case, including the prime suspect. Investigators did mention that they tried to contact all these suspects with varying degrees of success. The prime suspect they mentioned, however, was Brian Allen Elkner, who was a 77-year-old serial violent sex offender and former university lecturer. Two things which clearly go hand in hand. So once wrote a philosophical essay on the sublime criminal, which suggested that people should attempt to do evil in an attempt to gain status of hero. And he'd actually been to jail before in 1974. He had served 10 years for various sexual assaults. Elkner would break into victims' homes armed with a knife, very similar to Mr. Cruel. It was also revealed in court that he would have sexual fantasies of raping young women and girls. He was released from jail not long before the Mr. Cruel attacks began. It was also reported that a knife and a balaclava were found in Elker's home during a police search. However, despite all this, Elker has not been charged with the Mr. Cruel crimes and maintains his innocence. And besides circumstantial evidence, there really is nothing that suggests that Elkner is Mr. Cruel. In a 2016 interview, Elker stated, "I did my time and I have recovered my life pretty well. I've got a new family. I've rejuvenated myself as a writer and a construction designer and ran a business I've just retired from." So by April of 2018, a somewhat new and interesting theory emerged, and that was that Mr. Cruel and the Golden State Killer were one in the same. So if you're not aware of who the Golden State Killer is, he was a criminal in the US who was a serial killer, rapist and burglar who they actually arrested in April of this year after his horrendous crime sprees that lasted from 1974 to 1986. So to the best of our knowledge, the Golden State Killer, whose name is Joseph James DeAngelo, currently 72 years old, stopped his crime spree in 1986. And guess who started their crime spree in 1987? Yeah, none other than Mr. Cruel. Like Mr. Cruel, the Golden State Killer covered his tracks very well and was not caught for a very long time. So the Victorian Police here in Australia and the San Francisco Police actually compared notes on the Golden State Killer and the Mr. Cruel case, discussing the idea that potentially the Golden State Killer had fled to Australia to continue his crime spree. The two criminals both reportedly took meal breaks in the middle of their crimes. They were both armed with a gun and a knife. They both pretended to have conversations with people who were not there. Both used expert knots to tie up their victims, and they both claimed that they were there to rob their victims of money. They both wore dark coloured balaclavas with hair poking out underneath. They both crept into homes with large knives waiting to be found. They're both thought to be around the same age and are both pathologically meticulous in their crimes. And Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer, actually lived in Australia at one point in 1967. He served on the USS Canberra during a tour of duty in North Vietnam. And both criminals were actually investigated by the FBI despite living on opposite sides of the planet. So in 1991, after Karmein Chan's abduction, the FBI actually contacted the Victorian Police, sending them step by step on how to capture Mr. Cruel. The FBI told them to write down notes on what Mr. Cruel's interests were, how his relationships likely played out, and why he attacked when and where he did. The letter from the FBI also stated, "The offender has an intense interest in children, will have his own homemade pornography, and would typically live in a single family residence. And if Mr. Cruel was in a relationship, it stated that the partner would be aware of his sexual dysfunctions." So in 2016, a new appeal for information on the unsolved Golden State Killer crimes began. And this is when a retired LA Sheriff's Department Detective David Gates reached out to the Australian police. He suggested that a man that was wanted for a string of burglaries and had moved to Australia resembled the Golden State Killer. He described the perpetrator as a fair-haired college kid and a nasty piece of work. Despite all this, however, there really is no evidence that Mr. Cruel and the Golden State Killer were one in the same. It is really just speculation, and we have no solid proof. Law enforcement also believe that it is highly unlikely. And the final statement from the Victorian Police on the matter of Mr. Cruel and the Golden State Killer stated, "Victoria Police are aware of the matter regarding the Golden State Killer in the US. This was reviewed in relation to the outstanding Mr. Cruel investigations in Victoria, and any connections have been ruled out." Another connection that the Mr. Cruel case had to another case in Melbourne was that of 13-year-old missing schoolgirl Bung Siraboon, which I actually did a video on my other channel, so if you want to hear Bung's story, I'll link that down below. She actually went missing in 2011 on her way to school, so quite some time after Mr. Cruel's thought to be last attack, and it wasn't within his methods. He didn't break into Bung's home. The perpetrator took her just outside of her school grounds. The only real connection between Bung and Karmein were their age. They were both 13 years old and they were fairly similar in appearance. And of course, they were both from Melbourne. However, no solid connections have been made between the two cases, and personally, I think because they were so far apart, it is pretty unlikely that Mr. Cruel was involved in the Bung Siraboon case. So I'm going to go over a few theories quickly, and the first one being that potentially Mr. Cruel worked in law enforcement. And I say this because he was very particular, very planned out, very meticulous, and he knew how to get rid of DNA evidence. He was very clever in the sense that he disposed of the girls' clothing and bathed them very carefully. So there is a chance that potentially he worked in police or somewhere in law enforcement where this was just the sort of person he was. He was very structured in his ways and planned out and knew what to do to cover a crime. It's also possible that he worked in the education system, as two of the girls, Karmein and Nicola, had gone to the same school. So is it possible that he has access to school records? Not to mention the fact that all the attacks fell during Australian school holidays. And what I find most creepy of all is that he knew the name of his second victim, Sharon Wills. Now, I don't know how you would know the name of your victim unless, well, they do believe he did watch these families for weeks or months at a time, but would he have got their names? I guess it's definitely a possibility. If he had been stalking them, stole some mail, or were watching them and heard them speak to one another. And of course the Golden State Killer is another theory, but again, it's definitely an interesting theory, but I don't think that one is possible because his crimes were so heinous in the US. Why come to Australia and sort of start from step one, which was a home invasion and attacking a girl, and then work his way back up to killing? It doesn't really make sense, but I guess anything's possible. Let me know some of your theories in the comments, or if I've left out any information, please tell me so we can continue to discuss it in the comments. Thank you for watching. Like, comment, subscribe if you found this video interesting, and I'll see you in the next video. Have an amazing day, guys, and stay safe.